Hey everybody, welcome to chapter number 7, Basic Annotation. In this chapter, we will be discussing 7 different sections. Section number 1 will be the definition of annotation and dimensions. Section number 2, how to edit dimension styles and create new ones. Section number 3, text. Section number 4, text and leaders. Section number 5, new text styles. Section number 6, new leader styles. And section number 7, tags. This video is on section number 1, the definition of annotation and dimensions. So let's talk about annotation. What exactly does the term annotation mean? Annotation allows you to add explanation, instruction, technical information, and description to your construction documents. There are 3 different major categories of annotation in Revit, and those are dimensions, text, and leaders. Dimensions show measurements in a project and consist of extension lines. These are extension lines here. A baseline, which is this horizontal line here. The actual numeric dimension, and then an architectural tick. This stacking of the dimensions, where we have one set of dimensions over the other, is called a baseline dimension. Now in Revit, dimensions are used to give measurements. So to tell me this center line of this window is 5 foot 1 inch from the edge of this wall. But they also will help you in modeling your Revit geometry. We're going to talk about their basic function today, and then in a different chapter, we'll talk about how they'll help you model. There are a lot of different types of dimensions in Revit, and all of our different types of dimensions can be found on the Annotate tab on the Dimension toolbar. We have the aligned, linear, angular, radial, diameter, and arc length dimensions. Each of them have the same main job, which is to give dimensional quality to elements in Revit, but they all do their job differently. Now let me talk about the different parts of dimensions a little bit more. The baseline of a dimension is a place where the actual numeric dimension sits. An extension line shows you where a dimension starts and stops. It somewhat points down to where that happens. And then the architectural tick gives you a visual indication of starting here, going a distance, and then stopping here. There are a lot of different types of dimensions in Revit, like I said before. And I want to talk about those different types of dimensions. But before I do that, I want to talk about a few characteristics of dimensions. I want to talk about the fact that you can lock dimensions. And that means that when you dimension something, like from this wall to that wall, you have the ability to take that dimension and lock it when you're finished. And what that means is that if somebody tries to move or delete one of these walls, they're notified that there is a locked constraint, and that by moving or deleting or otherwise altering, that will be destroyed. We have baseline dimensions or stacked dimensions, where you have one string of dimensions here and then you have a second one on top. And each of these different baseline dimensions dimension different elements. For example, this first string of dimensions, it will dimension to specific items on the floor plan. So the openings and the interior partitions. Whereas the second set of dimensions will dimension the outside dimension of the design. Okay, let's talk about the different types of dimensions now and sort of how they function. We have the aligned dimension, okay? And the aligned dimension will allow you to create a dimension that is aligned with a specific object. Meaning, when I create this dimension, it is the same angle as the dimension or as the object it's dimensioning. It's aligned with that object. we have a linear dimension where regardless of what we dimension, we are going to get a straight dimension. Okay. We have an angular dimension where we're allowed to dimension angles. We have a radial dimension and a diameter dimension, which will allow us to dimension something circular. Let's create a wall here so that we can dimension a circular object. Create a nice little desk in the middle of this space. Okay. I'm going to come back to annotate, radial. I'm going to hover over the radius, click. There's my radial dimension. I have a diameter. Click. There's my diameter. And I have my arc length, which will allow me, when I have an arc, to dimension it. We don't quite have an arc in this example. But those are all the different types of dimensions. Now, the dimensions are one of those things that I really love about Revit. And I love them because they're so easy to use. Let me show you how easy dimensions are to use in Revit. Okay, we're going to dimension a few things here, and I'm going to do it by deleting these dimensions up here and creating some new ones. All right, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to the Annotate tab. We're going to initiate whatever dimension we want to use to dimension objects on our model. And in this case, I think I'm just going to use an aligned dimension. Now, to shortcut to an aligned dimension is DI. So I could click on the dimension or icon, or I could type DI. Click. I click on the object that I want to dimension. It highlights blue. Now, if that's not the object I want to highlight or I want to dimension, I'm going to tab and I'm going to cycle select to what I want to actually dimension. When the object turns blue that I want to dimension, I'm going to click. I'm going to move in the direction I want to dimension, and I'm going to hover over objects that I may want to dimension. So you'll notice that as I move down this wall, I get different points on different objects that I can dimension. So I can click, 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 tab, select, click. Now I've drawn a few different dimensions here. I want to end my dimension string. I can pull it up as far as I want it to go, right? I can bring it very close. I can bring it to the inside. I'm going to rest them here. To end this command, I'm going to click in space. Click. And my dimensions are finished. Okay. I have a few things I want to point out. Number one, we have a lock here, which if I click on that, it will constrain this dimension. And I also have an equality symbol here, where if I click on that, Revit, this is not going to work out very well, but Revit will take all of the objects that I have dimensioned and it will attempt to make their spacing equal. Okay. All right, so that's my first string of dimensions. You'll notice that when I finish that dimension, I wasn't taken out of the command. So this is a continuous command. I could go and start dimensioning a few other things. Click, click. I'm panning, click, click. Drag this out, click in space, and I'm done. Now I'm still ready to dimension. So I'm going to pick my place to dimension again. Tab, select, click. I'm going to do an outer to outer dimension. And I can stack this just above that primary string of dimensions. Now I forget how to, end the command. If you forget, you pull your mouse out into space and you click, and that will end your dimension. All of these dimensions function in a similar manner. If I click on linear, I can, I can highlight an object. A little trouble with linear. Let's move on to another one. Angular, click, click, pull this out, click another time. But essentially, the methodology and the process behind creating dimensions will be to click on the dimension you want, click on an object you want to dimension, and just continue clicking until you're finished dimensioning. This ends section number 1, the definition of basic annotation and dimensions.